Welcome, listener, in the shadows. We bring stories into the light. Join me as we explore the encounters no one speaks of and the things that watch from the dark. Before we dive into tonight's terrifying tale, a quick question. Do you dare wear the fear? Our exclusive Shadows merch is here. Hoodies, tees, and more, designed for those who embrace the darkness. Get yours before they vanish forever. Link below. The town of Blackwood was little more than a cluster of buildings pressed against the highway, dim yellow lights glowing behind rain-streaked windows. A single gas station, a diner with flickering neon letters, and a motel, its vacancy sign buzzing softly in the cold air. Ethan pulled into the cracked parking lot, the engine grumbling as he killed the ignition. His pulse was still uneven, his nerves raw, but for now he was here. Somewhere real. The motel's front desk was run by a gaunt man with sunken eyes, who barely acknowledged him beyond taking his cash and sliding over a tarnished brass key. Room 6. The hallway smelled of damp carpet and old smoke. Ethan shoved open the door, locking it behind him before slumping onto the creaking mattress. His body ached, his mind a restless blur of fog and faceless shapes. He wasn't sure how long he lay there, staring at the water-stained ceiling before he noticed it. A book, wedged between the wall and the bedside table, hidden just enough that no one had cared to move it. The spine was cracked, the leather cover worn. No title. Something in his gut told him to leave it alone, but he didn't. Ethan pried it from its resting place, flipping through yellowed pages filled with tight, handwritten text. The first few were nonsense, dates, notes, hurried scribbles, until a heading stopped him cold. The Harlow ones. His breath shallowed. The page was old, but the words felt alive. They do not belong here, but they walk among us. Their faces are void, their forms shifting in the spaces between. They do not speak. They do not chase. They simply watch until you listen. A pit formed in Ethan's stomach. His hands trembled as he read on. Once seen, they do not forget. His hands trembled, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The Harlow ones. They were real. The thing he saw on the road, the thing in the store. It wasn't just his imagination, wasn't exhaustion twisting his mind. They were watching. He forced himself to move, to think. The book had warned him. Keep moving, keep the lights on. His fingers scrambled for the bedside lamp, twisting the switch until it flooded the room with weak yellow light. He stood, pacing, breathing deep to quiet the rising panic. Never listen when they whisper. Ethan clenched his fists. He had listened. He had heard them. And now a dull, metallic weight pressed against his leg. The key. His stomach twisted. The old man, Frank, had given it to him back at the gas station, pressing it into his palm with that cryptic warning. You give this to Mercer, hell know what to do, son. He dug it out of his pocket, holding it up to the light. It was heavy, antique-looking, with scratches carved deep into the metal. No markings, no numbers, just a cold, unshakable purpose. But what did it go to? Ethan's eyes darted to the book on the floor as if it might offer an answer. It didn't, but the final pages were different. Not the same careful notes, but coordinates. A location. His throat tightened. No way. I should get the hell out of here. But the key burned cold in his palm, and deep in his gut he knew this was meant for him. He had to find out why. Ethan ran his thumb over the edges of the key, his mind racing. The coordinates on the final pages of the book had drawn him in, each digit staring back at him like a puzzle piece that had been waiting for him to arrive. There was no turning back now. He had already seen too much. The Harlow ones were real, and he had felt their presence more intimately than anyone should. Whatever the key opened, whatever door it led to, it was connected to them. His eyes flicked toward the motel room's small window, the pale light from the street lamp casting long shadows across the floor. The eerie silence of the room made his skin crawl. He needed to leave, but part of him, an awful, insistent part, wanted to know. What had Frank known? Why had the old man given him the key? Ethan grabbed the book and the key, then shoved both into his jacket pocket. He stood there for a moment, staring out the window into the growing darkness, then grabbed his keys and headed for the door. His car was parked right outside, an anchor in the vast sea of uncertainty that had consumed him. The drive felt longer this time, the fog heavier, pressing against the windshield as though trying to smother him. His fingers tapped nervously against the steering wheel. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that every shadow in the mist was alive with something sinister. The key burned in his pocket, a constant reminder that whatever waited for him at the coordinates would not be easy to face. As he drove, the world around him seemed to warp, the trees shifting in his peripheral vision like living things, and the fog twisted and wove itself into shapes that vanished as soon as he looked directly at them. Every once in a while, he'd hear a whisper, low and faint, a voice that wasn't his own. He'd stiffen, grip the wheel tighter, and focus on the road ahead, but the words always faded before he could make them out. Finally, he arrived. The coordinates had led him to a dirt road, one that stretched far beyond the beaten path, where no sign of civilization could be found for miles. The trees here were older, gnarled, their branches twisting up into the sky like the fingers of ancient, forgotten gods. A rusted sign that had long since lost its paint lay half buried in the dirt, barely readable but still there, Harlow's Edge. The words made his stomach turn. He had read them in the book, the place where the Harlow ones were believed to originate. It was said that they weren't just beings of this world, but creatures tied to something much older, more ancient. The key was meant to open something here, something hidden, something forgotten. Ethan turned off the engine and sat in silence, staring at the dirt road ahead. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, and the weight of the air pressed down on him, thick and unnatural. He had no idea what he was about to face, but it was too late to turn back now. The Harlow ones were already inside his mind, and somehow, he knew, they would never let him go. His feet scraped against the gravel as he stepped out of the car. The air was colder here, biting at his skin as he walked toward what looked like an old, abandoned building in the distance, its outline barely visible through the fog. The key in his pocket felt like it was vibrating against his chest, urging him forward. As he neared the building, the front door creaked open, as if inviting him in. A faint light flickered from inside, barely noticeable, but enough to make his heart race. He glanced at the key again, then at the building's rusted door handle. He could feel the weight of the decision hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. Without thinking, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the key. The cold metal was slick against his fingers. He approached the door, the key in hand, and with a deep breath, inserted it into the lock. The door clicked open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. Dust hung in the air like a thick fog, and the floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he stepped inside. The walls were covered in old, faded tapestries, depicting strange, impossible landscapes, figures moving in ways that couldn't be real. The more Ethan looked, the more the images seemed to shift, just at the edge of his vision, like they were alive. In the center of the room was a pedestal and atop it a small chest, the kind that seemed both ordinary and out of place. It was made of dark wood, intricately carved with symbols that made his skin crawl, symbols that he recognized from the book. His breath caught. This was it. This was what Frank had meant. Ethan stepped forward slowly, cautiously, as if the air itself might collapse around him if he moved too fast. His hand hovered over the chest, and then, against every instinct telling him to turn and run, he opened it. Inside, there was nothing but a dark, hollow void. The chest itself seemed to swallow the light around it, as if it existed outside the laws of reality. It beckoned to him, pulling him closer with an irresistible force. And then he saw it. A single weathered piece of parchment with a symbol, the symbol he'd seen before in his dreams carved into its surface, the mark of the Harlow ones. As his fingers brushed against it, the room seemed to shift, the walls trembled, the light flickered, and then in the dark corners of the room, eyes opened, eyes he could feel watching him, drawing nearer. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the eyes around him grew clearer, unblinking, unyielding. They glistened in the dark, darted across the walls, the floor, the ceiling. He could feel them watching, their presence growing heavier by the second, an oppressive weight on his mind, each gaze pulling at him, pulling him deeper into their world. Ethan's hands shook as he clutched the parchment, the symbol on it burning into his skin, the lines twisting before his eyes as though they were alive. The walls seemed to close in tighter around him, the air thick with the scent of mildew and ancient dust. The shadows now felt alive, crawling toward him like fingers curling out of the dark. The eyes were everywhere. He could feel them pressing in on him, suffocating him, watching with hunger. His breath caught in his throat. The whispering had grown louder, impossible to ignore now. It filled his ears, reverberating through his skull like 1,000 voices murmuring in unison. "You cannot escape. You are ours." Ethan staggered back, the chill of the room creeping into his bones. He couldn't move, couldn't think. The air was wrong. Something wasn't right. He was about to break. His mind was on the edge of losing it entirely. The hollow ones weren't just in the room anymore. They were in him, pressing into his mind, slithering through the cracks, filling the empty space inside his thoughts with their dark weight. But then he remembered. The book, the symbols, the chant. His fingers curled around the parchment with sudden resolve. The chant from the book had been in Latin, a dead language, its power hidden in the forgotten syllables, long buried beneath time's decay. The words had power. He could feel it, but only if he spoke them right. His mouth was dry, his voice barely a whisper, but the words began to fall from his lips, trembling at first, then with growing confidence as the room seemed to respond. Ex tenebris, ex abyssus, ex profundis, ego impero. The symbol on the parchment flared beneath his fingers, a sudden rush of heat flooding through him. The air around him buzzed, the temperature plummeting. His breath came in sharp bursts, freezing in the air before him as the walls seemed to close in even tighter. The floorboards beneath his feet groaned as if the very foundation of the building was shifting. Fugite, abite, non citis hic. The words felt foreign in his mouth, their meaning ancient, their power strange and foreign. It was as if he were speaking to something far older than anything human, something that had waited eons to hear those words spoken again. The words felt like a key unlocking something deep within the earth. The darkness in the room recoiled, as if stung by the words, but only for a moment. The eyes blinked open again, even more numerous now, their presence pressing in on him from every angle. They were everywhere above, below, to the sides, watching, waiting. But this time, Ethan felt something else, something deep, resonating, pushing back against them. The hollow ones were reacting. They were afraid. He spoke louder now, more urgently, the words filling the space around him with an ancient, forbidden energy. Absumus vas, eta mundus vas vocat. The floor groaned beneath him as if the room itself was alive, the air vibrating, the walls bending inward. He felt the presence of something far more immense than his terror, an unseen force that seemed to be pulling the darkness toward it, away from him. His chest tightened as the sound of the whispering grew louder, louder still, a cacophony in his skull. The hollow one's voices filled his mind, screaming, pleading. The world around him trembled, the ceiling buckling under unseen pressure, and the light flickered violently, casting everything into shadow. The darkness twisted and writhed as if trying to escape, the air itself pushing against Ethan, forcing him to his knees. But he held firm, his grip tightening on the parchment. His voice was a scream now. Sic citis damnati, narlite redire. With the final utterance, the room exploded with sound. The air cracked open as if the fabric of reality itself had been ripped apart. The walls shuddered, the very earth beneath him buckled and groaned as the eyes, those terrible, soul-devouring eyes, blinked out one by one as though some terrible force was pulling them into the void. For a moment, all was still. The room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the rapid, panicked beating of his own heart. The air felt different now. Empty, the oppressive weight pressing against him was gone. The whispers, the eyes, the feeling of being watched, it had all vanished. Ethan stood there, trembling, chest heaving as he looked around. The walls were now still, the oppressive dark shadows were gone, the air no longer pressing against him like a vice. The chest had returned to its once innocent state, the air around it still and undisturbed. He was free, but not for long. He knew, he could feel it, that this was only temporary. The hollow ones didn't die. They didn't go away. They had been pushed back, but only for a moment. They would return. They always did. And the key was more than just a way to banish them. It was the only thing that could keep the door closed long enough for him to escape. He grabbed the chest, quickly shoving it into his bag as he stumbled toward the door. His body was heavy, worn, the weight of the events pressing down on him. But his mind was clear. clearer than it had been in days. The room had quieted, the voices were gone. The hollow ones had retreated, for now, but their eyes would find him again. He would be ready. Ethan stepped out into the mist. The fog that surrounded him felt thicker now, pressing against his chest, almost alive as he hurried to his car. There was no time to linger. There was no safety in this town, in this place. He had to leave. He had to keep moving. And somehow, somewhere, he knew he would keep running. Because the hollow ones had tasted him, they would always want him. And no matter where he went, they would always be waiting. You made it back for now. But the things in the dark never truly leave, do they? They watch, they wait, and perhaps they remember you now, too. If you want to hear more, if you dare to listen again, step back into the shadows. Like the video. Subscribe, but know this, some doors once opened do not close so easily.